cold enough in here? I keep trying to turn the heat up. It's on, maybe it'll warm up.
I'm waiting for this thing to power up. I'll be right back. Oh, the classes room, my ass. Hallelujah. Good morning, Plainview. You cold enough? They look as cold as we are. Oh, they're further north. I guess maybe it's colder up there. me get logged on to this thing. Well, all the major battles have been fought in the war by the time that we're talking about. But I'm going to use that PowerPoint that you all have, the one, it's Civil War Part 2. We'll finish that up, and then we're going to look at Reconstruction a little bit. You all have materials on that now. I put up a Unit 10. I don't know if anybody's noticed it or not. It just magically appeared up there. That's the last unit. When we're done with Unit 10, we're finished. That's the last quiz. That's the last everything. Don't give up yet. don't quit until we're done. For people that are doing rewrites or something like that on their essay, people that haven't got it in for some reason or other, the absolute deadline is midnight on Monday, this coming Monday. After that, it's a 0, and that's a big hunk of your grade. If you haven't done it, some effort's better than no effort at all. Okay, let's get into this thing. Somebody tell me what Lincoln's policy was in the war. Very simple, one sentence, 5 words. What did Lincoln say I would do? I would do what? Anybody, come on. That definitely will be on the exam. But it's important that you understand it, because if you understand it, then you know what was always on his mind. I would save the Union. And we left off, Ulysses S. Grant was getting ready to go to Washington and take over the entire Union Army. He fought down in Tennessee, won the Battle of Missionary Ridge after firing General Rosecrans and taking over command in Chattanooga. He's going to push the army, the rebel army under the command of Braxton Bragg all the way back into Georgia. And when he leaves, he's going to leave orders behind for William Tecumseh Sherman to finish the job. If you remember the Union strategy, blockade all the seaports, long since done. Way back in 1862 it was done. Then gained full control of the Mississippi. Also done. Ever since Vicksburg fell in July of 1863, it's over with. Now the next step is subdivide the South. Grant's going to leave William Tecumseh Sherman to do that. Out west, he's going to come east and supervise the operations in the east, particularly the operations of the Army of the Potomac under General Meade. At the end of 1863, and the war's not going to be over for another year, whole year. At the end of 1863, Lincoln's already worried about what he wants to do. And what he wants to do is finish the war before he leaves office. And he's afraid, he was kind of a gloomy guy a lot of times. He was afraid that he'd become so unpopular with things like the draft and the war in general that he wouldn't get reelected and he wouldn't get the job done. He was afraid the next man that came along wouldn't push it all the way through. So one of the things he came up with, and I think we talked about this last time, was his 10% plan, how to bring the states back into the Union. And what he wanted to do was bring them in the simplest, easiest way possible. He didn't want recriminations, he didn't want revenge, anything. He wanted those states back in the Union, all accepting, all agreeing to the emancipation of the slaves. So, let me get this thing, get control of this computer here for a second. It's going nuts, isn't it? One of the things, by the way, that he did in November of 1863 was to travel out to the battlefield of Gettysburg, where he made his famous Gettysburg Address. He wasn't even the featured speaker. He kind of scribbled a speech down on some paper he had on the train, and when the main speaker got done, he stood up and made this speech, one of the most eloquent speeches known to mankind, the Gettysburg Address. In his life, this speech, and the speech at his second inauguration when he was reelected, are two of the most eloquent speeches that I've ever read in my life, and I've read a lot of them in a lot of places in the world. They're both carved in stone in Lincoln's Memorial in Washington, D.C. If you ever get a chance and you walk in there and you see Mr. Lincoln sitting up on a chair that looks like a throne, and these words of his etched into the walls of that monument, it's really impressive. Been known to see people stand there reading it and cry. Sherman's going to begin consolidating in Tennessee in December of 1864. He'll finish his march across Georgia. At the same time, the one southern holdout, Nashville, Tennessee, is going to go under federal control. He's going to get to Atlanta, Georgia. Around July, he's going to have it totally occupied in September. It wasn't easy fighting. The closer he got to Atlanta, the harder the fighting was. He's going to fight several different Confederate armies down there. Lincoln, though, comes up with this proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction in December. He actually wrote it, I think, in October, but it becomes official on the 8th of December, 1863. And he promises that if any state that left the Union, or claims to have left the Union because he doesn't accept that they really left, but any state that was in rebellion, if 10% of the people who could vote in that state in 1860 will now swear their allegiance to the Union and accept emancipation of the slaves, they can come back into the Union. And all will be forgiven, with a couple of exceptions. Senior officers of the Confederacy will not be forgiven right off the top. Also, anyone accused of mistreatment of prisoners of war, black or white, will not get their citizenship back. In fact, the only man that I know of, senior man in the South, who was hanged for his role in the Civil War, was the commanding officer of a Confederate prisoner of war camp, accused of mistreating Union prisoners there. The 10% plan was an easy way to get back into the Union. The radical Republicans, the hardliners, didn't want to be so nice. And early in 1864, they're going to sit down and they're going to work out their own plan. In the meantime, though, the Senate passes their version of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. The 13th Amendment, remember this, carve this in your hand, write it on your hand, don't take a bath for the next week. The 13th Amendment is what abolished slavery. That's all it did. It was very focused. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. That does away with slavery. Not the Emancipation Proclamation. Still not through the House of Representatives. It still hasn't been ratified. It'll be a little bit more than a year before it gets ratified. But it's on the way. Of course, the radical Republicans came up with the Wade-Davis bill, and the Wade-Davis bill was interesting. It had some good things to it. They wanted to totally transform Southern society, get rid of the plantation class and all those rich guys that had lots of slaves. They wanted votes and full rights of citizenship for freed slaves and other persons of color. But they insisted that in order for any Southern state to get back in the Union, that 50% of its voters had to sign an ironclad oath. Now, the ironclad oath was something that people signed when they got jobs with the federal government. In the ironclad oath, you swear that you're loyal to the government and that you've never done anything against the government. Oops. Not that many voters in the South could swear that they'd never done anything against the Union government. So what does that mean? That means that old generation is going to have to die off before the Southern states can get back in the Union. Lincoln didn't like that ironclad oath part of it, and when they gave it to him, it got through the Senate, got through the House of Representatives. When they put it on his desk, he just looked at his calendar, smiled, and did nothing with it. Why? And there's something called the pocket veto. Did we talk about that last time? Anybody remember what a pocket veto is? Here's how it works. When the two houses of Congress place a bill on the president's desk, he had three options. Option number one, he can sign it into law. Option number two, he can veto it and send it back to Congress. Option number three, he can do nothing with it at all. And in 10 days, if he does nothing with it at all, it becomes law anyway. But there's an exception. It can only come into law if Congress is in session. And after they dropped this note off on the president's desk, this bill off on the desk, they adjourned about 5 days later. And if that happens, if Congress adjourns before it becomes law one way or the other, it just goes and disappears. They call that a pocket veto. It's jokingly said that the president just folds it up, sticks it in his pocket, and forgets about it. That's what happened to the Wade-Davis bill. Now, the president's worried about the election of 1864. He's not done with the Civil War. That's all he thinks about. Finish it, conclude it, get what we were fighting for. So, to win the election, he's going to broaden the base of his party. And instead of running as a Republican Party candidate, he's going to join the Republican Party together with all the pro-Union Democrats. And he's going to form a party called the Party of National Union. And they're going to hold their party convention. And instead of having Hannibal Hamlin, the Republican from, I think it's Missouri, they choose a pro-union Democrat by the name of Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson, Lincoln liked for the job because he'd done a good job getting Tennessee back into the Union. Tennessee was already back in the Union. Lincoln really didn't like Hannibal Hamlin because Hannibal Hamlin was a radical Republican. Lincoln was a moderate, and he wasn't comfortable with Hamlin. So that's how they did it. A Republican is the presidential candidate, and a Democrat is the vice presidential candidate. He's thinking ahead. That man always thought ahead. He wasn't just thinking about the election. He was thinking about the effect it would have 4 years down the line. Lincoln was that way. Against them, ran a Democratic candidate, General George B. McClellan of New Jersey, the guy, one of the generals that Lincoln had fired. And McClellan was doing a tap dance in the Democratic Party because there were two factions in the Democratic Party. If you use slang, it was the War Democrats against the Copperheads. The Democrats that remained loyal to the Union when they went to war, and the Copperheads who, all along, even though they didn't join the South, they were against the war from the day one. And McClellan had served in the Army, in the Union Army, so he couldn't say he was against the war. But he wanted to negotiate the end of the war. He didn't want the war to go on anymore. He was going to offer an olive branch to the South and let them have their slaves if they wanted. Lincoln had a little help getting elected too. He needed, something else nice to happen that would get people's attention, and he got lucky. In August of 1864, just months before the election, Admiral David Farragut captures the port city of Mobile, Alabama, which was a major victory in the Deep South. Then in September, William Tecumseh Sherman is able to send a telegram to the president, "I have a gift for you. I give you Atlanta, Georgia. I'm in control." And then he's going to send another proposal to the president and to General Grant, suggesting, why don't I just finish the job and go all the way to the coast? And they're going to approve that, and he's going to take off. Eventually he'll get to Savannah, Georgia. But Lincoln's going to win this election with 2.2 million popular votes. McClellan gets about 1.8 million popular votes. But he gets far, far fewer electoral votes. The second inauguration speech, I wish I could read it. It's so damn good. I feel like reading it, but I'm not going to. It's just incredible prose. I mean, this belongs in a book, of famous writings and things like that. And it is. It's in a lot of books. Talking about finishing the war off, mending all the wounds of the people in the country, taking care of the people who have lost so much in the war, and developing a lasting peace. General Grant's busy getting the job done. Looking over General Meade's shoulder, he pushes the Union Army after Robert E. Lee. Drives them out of the immediate vicinity, that Northern Virginia area, drives them south towards Richmond. Some people call it the Overland Campaign. They split it up and give it different names. We're not going to study all the different aspects of it. I'll describe it in general terms as this. Grant's army, which was always larger than Lee's army from this point on, and was always growing, and Lee's army was always shrinking, he slams into Lee. Maybe Lee drives him back a little bit. But when it's over, then Grant slides around to one side of Lee like he's going to go around behind him, get between him and Richmond, so Lee is forced to back up. And then Grant slams into Lee again. And then he slides around to the side and Lee backs up again. Over and over and over again. Tens of thousands of men died. People called Grant a butcher, but what Grant did, in fact, was what he had to do to win the war. Nothing short of what he did would have won the war. So they go back in the direction of Richmond. Lee always defending Richmond. And then Grant kind of goes around Richmond, goes after the city of Petersburg. And they besiege the city of Petersburg. Remember when Grant took Vicksburg, he had a 48-day siege. And what he did was, he cut off all the places that could resupply Vicksburg. Now he's going to do that with Richmond. He's going to take Petersburg, that's going to isolate Richmond. They're already isolated from the north. Into the early months of 1864, General Lee's army keeps getting smaller. They're barefoot. They don't have enough equipment. They're short on ammunition. Their supplies are being cut off. If the Union Army ever captures Petersburg, they probably won't ever get any more supplies. He's in a desperate situation. While this is going on, Congress is still in action. In July of '64, they passed a Contract Labor Act. You don't need to write all the details on it, but remember this. This was an act which made it legal to import large numbers of workers for your factory if you didn't have enough workers available because they were all fighting in the war. You could go overseas, put a whole bunch of people on contract and bring them to the U.S. This law lasted on the books for about 10 years. Its main purpose was to bring immigrants. So we've had 2 laws passed during the war that do that. One of them was the Homestead Act of 1862, and one was this Contract Labor Act. Homestead Act brought immigrants because it offered free land. This one offers jobs and easy immigration. As Grant pushes south, they're going to besiege Petersburg. It's going to take a long time to get into Petersburg. In the meantime, there are lesser battles with Robert E. Lee's forces. There's a Union victory at a place called Five Forks on the 1st of April, 1865. And General Lee, somewhere along the line, and Grant, somewhere along the line, exchanged messages. And basically, both men want to end things. Lee's trying to figure out a way to do it without losing everything. But finally, on the 7th or 8th of April, he sends a message to Grant and says, I have to end this. I don't want my men to suffer anymore. Tell me what I should do. And Grant comes back to him and says, I will accept your surrender wherever you wish. You tell me the place and time. Then it will be over. And so Lee suggests Appomattox, Virginia. They meet in a private residence there. Lee brings his full staff in. The place is ringed with, Union soldiers, so they have to pass right through all these Union soldiers. Strangely enough, the Union soldiers remain orderly. There's nobody jeering at the Southern soldiers. They've all been through too much. In a way, they share the brotherhood of bleeding. General Grant does what he did at Vicksburg. He tells General Lee, tell your men to disperse and go home. He doesn't want prisoners. Lee, of course, is going to be a prisoner because he's a senior leader. Some of the senior generals will be. But the war, as far as General Lee is concerned, is over with. On the 9th of April, 1865. some months later, some of the radical Republicans want to put the senior leaders of the South on trial for treason and hang them. They wanted to do that to General Lee. General Grant intervened and prevented it. The war is pretty much over with. I'm going to flip down to it. Come on, machine. On the 9th of April, Lee is surrendered. Same day, another major force surrenders. On the 21st, Mosby's Raiders surrender. On the 26th, Joseph E. Johnson's fragmented army surrenders to William Tecumseh Sherman. Early May, a number of Confederate departments surrender. Alabama, Mississippi, East Louisiana, the Gulf District. On the 10th of May, Jefferson Davis is captured in Dannsburg, Virginia, trying to escape, wearing women's clothes. Surrender of the Confederate Department of Florida and South Georgia. Follow Thompson's brigade. Confederate forces in North Georgia surrender. Kirby Smith, the westernmost Southern commander, surrenders. All of them surrender by the end of May, except one ship, which really doesn't count. So the war is over. Unfortunately, the man that guided us through it all isn't there to see it. I don't know if you've ever seen this poem. Come on, machine. By Walt Whitman. Captain, oh my captain. He's talking about Abraham Lincoln in figurative way. The man who guided the ship of state is dead. What happened? On the 14th of April, on the evening of the 14th of April, his regular bodyguard was at home on vacation. He took his wife, decided to take the night off. He took his wife to Ford's Theater to watch a performance of Our American Cousin. Right after intermission, an actor who was well known in that theater worked his way into the presidential booth, walked up behind the President of the United States, and shot him in the head in point blank range. He stabbed the military officer that was there with his wife and the president and the president's wife, jumped over the balcony onto the stage of the theater. People were just stunned. Nobody moved. And hobbled out. He broke his foot jumping off the balcony, hobbled to the door. Somebody was holding a horse, and he ran for it. His name was John Wilkes Booth. For a number of years, he plotted to either kidnap or murder the President of the United States. This particular plot was a lot more complex than one man shooting the President. There's a whole group of people. Booth is to kill the President. A fellow named John Powell is to kill the Secretary of State at home. A fellow named Atzerodt is to kill the Vice President at the Kirkwood Hotel. They all failed except for Booth. One of them just didn't even try. He went off, and I think George Atzerodt chickened out and went and got drunk instead. The others made an effort but failed. The following morning, Abraham Lincoln dies. They'd taken him out of the theater into a boarding house across the street. He was surrounded by doctors, but none of them had anything they could do to save him. What am I doing here? Going the wrong way. That's a train that took Abraham Lincoln's body back to Illinois for burial. the old Nashville. The Secretary of War took immediate control of Washington, declared martial law. Eventually, Andrew Johnson will be able to assume the post of president. They put out rewards, dead or alive awards for Surratt, Booth, John Wilkes Booth, and others. They really didn't know everybody that was involved, but they'll figure it out pretty quickly. Booth makes it to a safe house where there's a doctor, and the doctor treats his foot, but federal troops catch up with him, and Booth dies attempting to escape, or at least that's the story we get. They arrest the doctor, throw him in jail. A lot of people say, why are you arresting the doctor? He's just helping a guy with a broken foot. Dr. Mudd was deep in the plot. That's why Booth went to him. In fact, the two of them had been involved in a plot planning to kidnap Lincoln several years before. Of the other members of the plot, Samuel Arnold was put on trial. He was supposed to be a guy guiding or helping out, supporting. He was sentenced to life in prison. He was pardoned in 1869. George Atzerodt was convicted of treason and hanged. David Harold was convicted of treason and hanged. Samuel Mudd, Dr. Mudd, was given life in prison, but while he was in prison, he did several really brave acts, including clearing up what could have been a plague of, I think, smallpox in the prison, and he was pardoned in 1869. Lewis Powell was convicted of treason and hanged. Edmund Spangler was pardoned in 1869. He really didn't know what was going on. He happened to be holding the horse for John Wilkes Booth. Mary Surratt was convicted of treason and hanged. A lot of people were aghast. They said, well, she was only a woman. What did she have to do with all of this? She ran the boarding house where John Wilkes Booth stayed and where some of them met. But she'd been involved in the earlier plot. She knew everything that was going on. She was part and parcel of it all. That photograph there you see, if you look carefully, there's one woman hanging there. Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Harold, George Atzerodt were all hanged together on July 7th, 1865 at Fort McNair in Washington, D.C. Some people couldn't stand and watch it. If you look carefully, some people are standing looking the other way. So we have a new president. His name is Andrew Johnson. And he will become involved in a fight over another issue. Slavery's over with. There's another issue called Reconstruction, rebuilding the South. And the radicals wanted to tear the South down and build it up again and do away with all the evils that helped promulgate slavery, helped continue slavery. Let's look at that other set of slides. You have all of this stuff available to you. Which one? The process of Reconstruction. When did it start? What was Reconstruction? It was a period of time. Most people think of it as after the Civil War. For, I don't know, 12 years or so. But the process of Reconstruction started well before the end of the Civil War. It's hard to say exactly where. When we started freeing slaves, as the war went on, when we started promoting immigration? It's hard to say. Some interesting things had happened, and we certainly don't have time to study all the little details. After Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation, President Jefferson Davis issued his own proclamation ordering that black Union soldiers and their officers, who happened to be white, but that were captured by Confederate troops, were not to be treated as prisoners of war, but were to be remanded to the Confederate state authorities. And you can just guess what that meant. Not nice. Lincoln's going to answer that anyone who mistreats American prisoners during the war will suffer the consequences. Union soldiers, black or white, are entitled to equal protection if captured by the enemy, and he threatens retaliation for Confederate enslavement of black prisoners of war. You know, eventually, just before the war ended, the South finally agreed that they were going to allow slaves to join the Confederate Army with the promise of freedom after the war. They didn't get very far with that. There's the two acts that brought immigration: the Homestead Act of 1862, the Contract Labor Act of 1864. Now comes the fight over Reconstruction. Radicals versus the moderates. Abraham Lincoln was a moderate. Let's talk about his point of view. Right up to the day that he was killed. In fact, the night before he went to see our American cousin, he stood on his balcony talking to the public down below. And he told them he wanted this war to be over, and he didn't consider any of the states to really have left the Union. He wanted to get them into operation before this December. And he didn't want any persecution, what he called bloody work. No bloody work. No radical restructuring. But of course, he won't be there to fight this fight. And I've often pondered what would have come out of it if Abraham Lincoln had lived another few years. But he's replaced by Andrew Johnson. He's 57 years old. He started out life as a tailor, had no formal education, but he was well self-educated. Moved from South Carolina to Tennessee. He tried to start his own new state when he was in Tennessee. That didn't work very well. He was a state representative, then a state senator, then a U.S. representative, governor, and U.S. senator in Tennessee. Eventually, Lincoln will make him the provisional governor of Tennessee Territory before Tennessee gets back into the Union. And then he will be elected vice president and become vice president in March of 1865. He was a strong Unionist, pro-Union Democrat, only Southern senator to remain loyal to the Union. He also agreed that the Union was indestructible, that those guys saying they quit didn't mean anything. He believed in the amnesty for the Southerners. The one kind of people that he didn't want to forgive, though, were the people that owned plantations and had slaves. Didn't feel like forgiving them. He hated rich people. But he wanted to let former Southern leaders begin to lead the states again. And he was a little bit weak on granting things like the vote to freed slaves. The South defied all of this. They're going to, when they become candidates for readmission to the Union, a lot of their people that they want to send to the Congress are former leaders in the South, like Alexander Stephens, the former the former vice president of the Confederacy. They nominated at least 4 different generals and a bunch of other people. They also started writing these little laws called the Black Codes. Now you have a blurb in your readings for Unit 10 all about the Black Codes. Read them. If you really pay attention to them, they look good when you start. They look like, hey, they're granting rights to the freed slaves. But by the time you end it, get to the bottom line, it looks like they're giving slaves the opportunity to become slaves again. The radical Republicans in particular were furious about this. They slowed it down, the states' efforts to become states again. Moderate Republicans got so angry at what the South was doing that they drifted in the direction of the radical Republicans. Representative Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, he considered the Confederate States as conquered provinces. He proposed the 14th Amendment. We'll talk about that in a minute. Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens were 2 of the leaders of the radicals. Even the moderates believed that the Southerners had given up their rights as citizens when they seceded. Some of the early things that were done, of course, that proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, written in October of 1863, published in December. The Wade Davis bill, an effort to make it more strict, didn't float. Disappeared under the pocket veto. 13th Amendment gets started by the Senate in April of 1864. Then it will be passed by the House of Representatives in January of 1865. It will take until December of 1865 to get ratified. Another thing they did in 1865, while Lincoln was still alive, was pass a bill creating the Freedmen's Bureau. This was an organization, listen here to the detail, an organization under control of the Department of War. And their job was to take care of slaves, recently freed slaves. Because a lot of freed slaves were wandering souls. They didn't know what to do next. It was to aid them with legal aid, food and housing, guidance, education, health care, and even employment. Get them jobs with private landowners. The Freedmen's Bureau pushed local property owners to hire freed slaves. It was also important helping freed slaves in the South find their families. It's going to last until 1872. It's only supposed to last for a year after the war. Abraham Lincoln asked Frederick Douglass, who he deeply respected, he asked Frederick Douglass, why don't you run the Freedmen's Bureau? And Frederick Douglass said, no, I don't have enough push to do any good. You need to take one of your trusted senior Army officers and put him in control. And so Lincoln did. He appointed Major General Oliver O. Howard. And they did a lot of good while they lasted. There's mugshots of the radicals, Thaddeus Stevens, Henry Davis and Benjamin Wade, the guys that did the Wade Davis bill, Charles Sumner, the guy that got beat up by Preston Brooks on the floor of the Senate. He hates people from the South. They want to punish the South. Don't blame him. Then there's Simon Chase. Now, he was Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury. Then Lincoln, when our friend, and I said use that term loosely, Roger B. Taney died, he needed a new attorney, or not attorney general, he needed a new Chief Justice of the United States, and so he appoints Simon Chase to be Chief Justice. Chase was an interesting man. He started out his political life as a Democrat, but he was against slavery, so he became a free soiler. Then he joined the Republicans, and then eventually he becomes a Democrat again. He agreed with rebuilding the South. He agreed with giving everyone the vote in the South. He didn't agree with having so much military in the South. He didn't agree with making these generals in the South in charge of Reconstruction. We'll talk about that. Another group in the South and in the North, mainly they were Democrats, the Bourbon Democrats. These were businessmen. Their main aim in life was to get the country going again economically. They wouldn't stand in the way of civil rights or anything like that. That wasn't their cause, though. Another group in the South were called the Redeemers. They claimed to be the allies of the Bourbon Democrats, but the Redeemers were people that wanted to return the South to what it was before the war. They wanted to go backwards. Those are the kind of people that wrote the Black Codes. Black Codes gave freedmen more rights than free blacks had before the war, but they still only had a limited set of second-class civil rights and no voting rights. Mississippi wrote the ones that I gave you to look at in your readings. South Carolina wrote some. They limited blacks' ability to control their own employment, to own property, and as a result of all these black codes that sprang up in all of these states, the Congress of the United States passed the first Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1866. By the time they'd done that, there was another organization born called the Ku Klux Klan, organized in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1865 by Confederate Army veterans. There were a lot of groups that called themselves the Klan, but the Klan itself really didn't have a national level or multi-regional structure. It was just different groups of people that said, we're in the Klan. Vigilantes, trying to chase the Republicans out of their state, trying to intimidate or bribe or whatever black people so that they wouldn't participate in the democracy in the South. Eventually, the federal government's going to have to take action against them. One of the things that the radical Republicans did in 1866 was pass the Civil Rights Act. It made everyone born in the U.S. and not subject to any foreign power a citizen. It was aimed mainly at freedmen. It was vetoed by Andrew Johnson, but later it was passed over his veto by the radical Republicans in Congress. Let's look at the amendments while we're at it. During this period of time, during Reconstruction, starting with the 13th Amendment, you have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. They're called the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th is very simple. It prohibits slavery in the United States. The 14th Amendment defines or redefines the rights of citizenship and also prescribes action to be taken against any state who tries to take away people's rights. It also has a little clause in it that makes it illegal to pay off the debts of the Confederacy. Why is that? Who are they talking to when they say nobody's going to pay the South's debts? Who are they really talking to? And why did they put it in the Constitution, in an amendment to the Constitution? I mean, that doesn't look like it belongs there. So why did they do it? It's mainly the doings of the radical Republicans. And the reason they did it, well, who did the Confederacy owe money to? European countries. who chipped in money to help them out. And basically, they're looking at the European countries and saying, fat chance you'll ever get your money back. And they put it in the Constitution because if you stick something in the Constitution that's ratified by all the states, it's really, really hard to get rid of it. If they just passed a law, the next Congress that came in could throw that law out. So they put it in the Constitution. The 15th Amendment will come later, 1869, and it specifically focuses in on the denial of the right to vote, denial of what we call franchise, because of race, color, or past servitude. The 14th and 15th Amendments weren't very popular with the Southerners, even though they were struggling to get their states back into the Union now. 12 of the Southern states rejected the 14th Amendment in February of 1867. So what the Radicals did was they told the Southern states, if you want back into the Union, you have to ratify the 14th Amendment. That's part of your readmission process. So the 14th got ratified in July of 1868. There were still three states that weren't back in the Union yet: Virginia, Texas, and Mississippi. Oh, and Georgia got kicked back out because they tried to cheat when they were getting readmitted. And all of them were told, if you don't vote to ratify the 15th Amendment, you can't come back in. So they all did. Let's talk about the election of 1866. It's a midterm election. Now you've got the president that wants to run Reconstruction his way. You've got the Congress who are becoming more and more radicalized because of the way the South is responding with things like black laws and violence. They want to control Reconstruction. There's a midterm election, not a presidential election, just a congressional election. President Andrew Johnson's going to tour all around the country, wherever he can go, making speeches to support either Democrats or moderate Republicans. But no one's listening. The radical Republicans are going to have a landslide victory in this election. When the dust settles after the election of 1866, the Republican Party has 77.2% of all the seats in Congress. So they have enough people there to override a presidential veto, for example. Interesting process if you look at my little chart here. Those are all the states who left the Union. They seceded. One of the last states to leave was Tennessee. They joined the Confederate States in between February and May of '61. They were readmitted to the Union almost all of them. Well, all of them were readmitted by March of 1870. But look at the last column. Every one of these states turned Democrat by 1877. Every one of the southern states. The Democratic Party was run by the Bourbon Democrats and the Redeemers. They were against human rights. They were against everything like that. And slowly but surely, they're going to get control. Now, right after the war is over, you see majorities. For example, South Carolina's legislature, the majority were black. But by hook or by crook, within 5 or 6 years, all the Republicans, and particularly all the black voters, are out of the legislature. At the end of the war, there were two African Americans who were in the Senate of the United States, and a number of people in the House of Representatives. But within about 6 years, they're all gone. They're out. With the help of groups like the Klan, the Knights of the White Camellia, the Red Shirts, and other groups like that, Black Americans stopped voting. Now, still got this fight between Johnson, who wants to let the states in pretty quickly, and the radicals. By 1867, the radicals have a majority in Congress. They're going to pass 3 laws that we call the Reconstruction Act. They have lots of different names. Just to make it simple. Bear with me on this. The first one will be, and they're all passed almost at the same time, and they're all vetoed by President Johnson, and the vetoes are all overturned because the Republicans have such a large majority. The Military Reconstruction Act divides the remaining states that aren't admitted yet back into the Union, 10 states, into 5 districts. Each district will be placed under the control of a major general in the Union Army. And he'll, of course, have a lot of his army with him. They don't want the president to interfere, and since he's technically the commander-in-chief of the military, they also pass the Command of the Army Act, which says, yes, the president's the commander-in-chief, but he can only deal with the army by talking to the general, commanding general of the army, which at the time was Ulysses S. Grant, and they thought he was one of their guys. And they told him also he couldn't transfer or fire that general. Then they closed one other potential loophole. They had a guy they liked as the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. It's funny because Stanton was technically a Democrat, but he was probably really a Republican, spying on the Democrats. They were happy to have him in office, but they were afraid maybe President Johnson would fire him. So they passed the Tenure of Office Act, all at the same time with these other acts, and that said the president can't fire a member of his cabinet unless he has the advice and consent of the Senate of the United States. So they're going to make it impossible for the president to get rid of Stanton. And the president's going to try and get around this. Now, here's the 2 goals they had. One was to get control of Reconstruction. The other one was to trap the president into doing something wrong so they could impeach him. And they knew their man. He wasn't stupid, but he had a temper. When they told him he couldn't fire people from his own cabinet, he tried to find a way around that. Told Edwin Stanton he was fired, told General Grant, you're now the Secretary of War. Grant tippy-toed away from that really fast. Stanton refused to leave the office, and Congress will impeach President Johnson for violation of the Tenure of Office Act. He's brought to trial in the Senate. The House of Representatives are the people that do the impeachment. He's brought to trial in the Senate, and he just misses being convicted by 1 or 2 votes. What's this all about? The majority of the Senate and the House of Representatives were against him. Why didn't they convict him? They didn't convict him because wiser heads in the Senate decided it's not a good idea for us to establish the practice of firing a president who was elected by all the people just because we don't like him. So they drew the line and didn't quite kick him out of office. But he got the message anyway, and he went back to the White House and stayed in the White House until the end of his term of office. He wanted to run again, but he didn't stand a snowball's chance in a hot place of doing that. There's the 5 military districts I was telling you about on that map. Florida, Georgia, and Alabama were one district. Mississippi and Arkansas were one. Texas and Louisiana were one. That was district number 5. Tennessee, North and South Carolina were one. And Virginia, for some reason, was one. There's Ulysses S. Grant and Secretary of War Stanton. There's a cartoon about it, the standoff. I think they actually put sandbags around Stanton's office. There's a picture of the trial of Andrew Johnson in the Senate. The U.S. presidential election of 1868, the Republicans are going to pick the most popular man in the United States, Ulysses S. Grant. He is the new rock star, if you want. I hate to insult a person by calling him a rock star, but he was the guy everyone wanted to be able to tell their kids, I shook the president's hand. Even more popular than, say, Andrew Jackson was in his time. He ran against a Democrat, a Northern Democrat, no Southern Democrat would stand a chance. Ran against a Northern Democrat named Horatio Seymour. Before we get, Grant's going to win this election, spoiler alert. Before we get there, let's talk about the situation in the South. By 1868, all but Virginia, Mississippi, and Texas were back in the Union. So all those other states get to vote now. Georgia was in the Union, then got kicked back out because of something they did when they were being admitted. How about the freedmen? Where are the freedmen now? Well, some of them did military service. It was an easy way to have a job. Some of them organized schools, churches with the help of the Freedmen's Bureau. By 1890, there were 1.3 million registered Black Baptists. They organized clubs and societies. In a way, they took advantage of the fact that they were discriminated against in the South because they formed very strong communities and they had their own economy within those communities, and so they were able to survive. They didn't need the white guy necessarily to survive. It's a funny thing because they weren't totally unified because the freed slaves resented the black people who were already free. You're different. You didn't go through this. You don't know what it was like. That sort of thing. You see that in a lot of places. All of the northern black people were resented by the southern ex-slaves. But they had 600 African Americans in state legislatures in the South, 2 U.S. senators, 14 U.S. representatives. They were in the majority in South Carolina for 2 years. And then a strange thing happened. These people came out of the woodwork and started intimidation and started chasing Republicans out, the white Republicans out, and started doing bad things to the black Republicans. And suddenly, the amount of people of African origin dwindles to nothing, and the registered Republicans dwindle away to nothing. Everybody knows what a carpetbagger is, right? That's a guy from the north who packed all his goodies in his carpet bag and rushed down south to, in the opinion of Southerners, to take advantage of the poor defeated South. In the opinion of many Northerners, it was to go down and help the South rebuild. I think you could probably split that 50-50. Scalawags. Scalawags were Southerners who believed that the South needed to be rebuilt, that they needed reconstruction, they needed to be reorganized. People like James Longstreet, Southern general, fought in the Battle of Gettysburg. He was against slavery. The only reason he was fighting for the South was out of regional loyalty. There were a lot of others like that. Believe it or not, General Beauregard, the guy that fired on Fort Sumter, he spent a lot of time as an engineer rebuilding in the South and doing good things and not doing racially sensitive things. Radical highs and lows. There were new constitutions in almost every one of the southern states. Almost any white male or black male, any male could vote, at least by law. Apportionment of voting was a little bit fairer. Much more important, more state positions became elective offices, and there were 600,000 brand new black students in school by 1877. You have to remember, right before the war, as those laws got worse and worse and worse, it was illegal to educate a slave. The lows, there was a great deal of corruption. A lot of those carpetbaggers that came down were crooked. Not all of them were helping rebuild the South. There were crooked contractors all the way through the war, by the way, not just at the end of the war. Crooked people selling supplies to both sides. One of my favorites are the disappearing blankets. You take a blanket, make a really thin blanket, then you soak it in a pile of the scraps from making yarn. It's called sizing. And it gets stuck in that thin fabric, and so you end up with a fairly thick blanket until the first time it rains, and then all you've got is a gauze bandage left after that. People were selling blankets like that. Some suppliers were selling supplies to both sides. Gouging. There was corruption up in New York. The Democratic Party machine in New York, under the control of a guy named Boss Tweed. We'll talk about him later sometime. There was a ring that controlled supply of natural gas up in Philadelphia. And there was terrorism in the South. We'll pick up talking about some of those issues, and we'll get to the presidency of General Grant next time around. Thank you very much.